Hey guys, and welcome to CANNAMAntv. My name is Connor McLeod, and in this interview, I speak with Medical Cannabis Patient Advocate at Access Kaneh, Tim Henley. In this interview, we discuss what led Tim to become active in the cannabis industry, the current condition of the UK cannabis industry, medical cannabis in the UK, what Access Kaneh is and what it hopes to achieve, substance abuse and cannabis' potential to fall into this category, Cannabis Adult Use, and Access Kaneh's Police Crime Commissioner campaign and associated questions. Make sure and like and subscribe, and join us on Patreon, where you can help to build a stronger cannabis media platform. Now then, let's talk cannabis. Thanks very much for joining me here, Tim.
No problem. It's a great pleasure to be here. I think that the important thing is to tell you about why I'm in the cannabis industry and the journey I've got to get here. So effectively, it started around 2016 when CBD was just really starting to take off and show some real promise. My wife and I started a CBD company in the UK, but that was just after we started, and then just afterwards, PayPal and Google started restricting all the kind of cannabinoids, and it became impossible to do. So at the same time, my nephew started a PhD at Aston University, which turned out to be for GW Pharmaceuticals, looking at CBD and how effective it was for people with epilepsy, which turns out to be part of the research that actually went on to get the license, the marketing authorization from the MHRA for Epidiolex. So you kind of see the bits falling into place here.
Yeah.
Really interesting times. I kind of was a founder director of the CTA because it was very focused on CBD, and I was much more interested in the much wider cannabis economy. I left the CTA and started working for a Canadian cannabis company called Namaste. Dry herb vaporizers were their speciality, and I ended up being the product buyer for it, which was a great job to have, to be honest, and really important. I have to say, at the same time, my mother developed Alzheimer's, and I was really interested in exploring the possibilities of using CBD and potentially medical cannabis with her. The problem was medical cannabis then was not in existence. It was nigh on impossible to get. As medical cannabis became available, I decided to leave Namaste. They were going back to Canada to make more money in the Canadian market because adult use access was going to be available. So we took up the baton where they left off, and we set up Access Kaneh, which is effectively a company that promotes and advocates the use of medical cannabis. We're an agency. We advocate for people to look at medical cannabis and to look at the potential, because, and this all stems from the endocannabinoid system. And I don't think enough people know. It's really interesting. I was on a course yesterday for clinical professionals who were being trained about medical cannabis. And there were some medical students there. And I told you about my nephew who did his PhD. He's going on to be a doctor and is training actually at Newcastle University. And they're still not teaching about the endocannabinoid system. You just can't make this stuff up. The medical students in today's day and age, the engine management system of the body, and doctors are still not being taught about it. And then you end up thinking, well, this is why nobody really understands the power and potential of medical cannabis, because the clinicians still aren't understanding the foundations from where it's built on. So it is a really interesting area to be in. And as I say, we actively look for patients who want to try and see if they can get medical cannabis.
It's, do you know, when I hear that, when you say that they don't actually educate potential clients now for the medical sector, it's like, that's where is the change supposed to be input? You know, this is a stumbling block that seems to be. I know that we have the Medical Cannabis Clinician Society, which attempts to educate, but that's not even nearly wide enough. I mean, what would you suggest to roll out a mass education program?
Well, there are things happening. There are things happening. The UK can no longer be kind of King Canute holding back the ocean and saying, look, this just doesn't work anymore.
Yeah.
It is being dragged, and to a certain extent kicking and screaming. But you have to say the original change stemmed in California. California, when the AIDS epidemic hit in the 1980s, it was activists that were looking for potential end-of-life treatments for people who got AIDS. And so California legalized access to cannabis because it was a really useful tool in the arsenal when you've got nothing else left to try and get a semblance of quality of life. And so it all started really in California. But the company that's really taken medical cannabis on is GW Pharma, a UK-based company. And that's why you will see this statistic that's kind of, I don't think it's true anymore, that the UK is the biggest producer of cannabis in the world. I think Canada's exceeded us by some way, but the statistical evidence isn't there yet to prove that. There's just so much going on. So I think slowly but surely, the UK is moving forward, slowly but surely. And when we talk about medical cannabis, what is medical cannabis? To apply for a medical cannabis prescription, you have to have a documented condition. So you have to have been to your GP and you have to have said, look, I've got this problem. They have to have prescribed you at least 2 medications or potentially a treatment and medication. So physiotherapy may fit into that thing. So you have this kind of opportunity. Once you've crossed that criteria, then it is, and I have to say, the doctors that are prescribing medical cannabis in the UK at the minute, I don't think get enough recognition because they're standing up, they're saying, we believe in cannabis, and we're actually getting patients that are starting to see real benefit from the treatments they're on that had no benefit or didn't find effective relief from traditional, what are called market authorized treatments. So that means they've been through the trials, the MHRA has licensed this medicine for a particular condition. So once you have that, you can then start to make medical claims. Now, cannabis isn't in that area. It is an unlicensed specials medication, so you can make no medical claims for it. But in essence, the evidence, what is now termed real world evidence. So everybody talks about randomized trials, placebo-based, RCTs, randomized clinical trials. And effectively, the evidence base is traditionally based around pharmaceuticals proving they are effective, at least 51% more effective than the current treatment. So that's how you get a marketing authorization. Cannabis is very difficult to put in a placebo. How do you create a placebo for cannabis? The smell, the taste, all of the kind of things that we all understand about cannabis. Very hard to replicate something like that unless you compare extracts. Extracts are in a different area. So the Australians have a system that's been slightly longer in existence. They allowed cannabis slightly before us, but they've accelerated much quicker in the way that people can access cannabis. But I think these changes are really starting to take effect and things are really moving forward. And the whole process is becoming easier to access medical cannabis.
And it's education, as you previously mentioned, is crucial, which is essentially, is this why you formed, would you refer to this as a manifesto or just a campaign proposal that you're bringing to the PCCs?
One of the reasons that I was really passionate about this is the cannabis plant is capable of so much change. Now, you're a young man. I'm an old geezer. I mean, my time is kind of coming to the end in terms of my working life. But however, I am really committed to moving cannabis from a negative connotation to a really positive affirmation of how we need to change. Depending upon how you look at these things, And if you take on the QAnon and the big reset, this whole idea that something is going to reset, I actually think that's got some legs. There does need to be a big reset.
Mm-hmm.
We cannot carry on the way we are. We are sanitizing the earth to extinction. And your generation is the one that's going to pay, not mine. I'll be long gone and buried by the time that this all really plays out. You've got climate change. You've got so many different habitat failures that are happening. So what do? We take one of, in fact, on this course yesterday, I found out it was the very first documented medicine. So we are talking in Chinese herbal literature, the herbal medicine literature, the documentation of how cannabis was used as medicine. So that is the length of history that we're talking about here. Pharmaceutical companies have been in existence for about 100 years. But in those 100 years, and I don't make the connection that it's only down to pharmaceutical companies, but the Industrial Revolution has really started to change the way the earth is looked at. Whereas here is a herbal medicine that has been used for centuries, and across the world, this is not just here, it is across the world, everybody is saying, right, it needs to conform to these standards, GMP. And this is kind of, we're making concrete and steel enclosures to grow a plant. We're using lighting to grow this plant that grows very well outside. And this can't carry on, because if in 2030, 2040, the kind of power demands, the concrete use, the amount of carbon we're releasing, these are real issues. So the cannabis industry is just starting out across the world. It's really just starting out, but it can be a real engine of change if it's done correctly. At the moment, everybody's just really happy that the regulators are allowing us access to it, and that's good enough. But we need to lift our heads up out of the book and look at the horizon and say, well, hold on. If we carry on growing these things in concrete and steel greenhouses, we're creating more carbon, so we have to plant more trees. Well, actually, cannabis has two main forms. There is a form called hemp, which is low THC, and there is cannabis, as we call it, which is high THC. If you could grow hemp in fields, you could sequester more carbon than the trees that you plant in the same space across the same period. And we are talking multiples of carbon are sequestered in a better way using hemp. So in one way, we're going to grow it in greenhouses. In another way, we're going to have to offset all that construction we've got to put into by growing it hemp fields. So I don't think that's the right way. And we just need to persuade regulators that real change is coming. The UK is committed by 2030 to reduce its carbon output. How are we actually going to do that? Between now, 9 years' time, and 2030, how do we achieve massive carbon reductions that we're going to see? These are the questions that we've got to start answering. To me, cannabis is one of the best ways of doing it.
It seems like it seems like cannabis is the best way of doing it. I mean, let's be honest, even you mentioned the sequestration properties there, but the phytoremediation is also associated with cannabis, just gives a small glimpse into the potential of it. And when you mentioned as well about the additional industries, I think that's why it's so difficult for many people who are new to cannabis to think that it's not one variable that caused cannabis to be prohibited in the first place. They associate the pharmaceutical industry or the fossil fuels industry or the paper industry. The reality is it's an accumulation of these variables that led to the collective prohibition of cannabis in the first place. And I think that's what the difficulty when it comes to educating people and establishing legitimate change, because that prohibition is interwoven throughout different fabrics of society. So inevitably you have to go through these different alleyways of discussion through different categories of industry in order to actually fully achieve what we really should have had over 100 years ago.
Oh, absolutely. As with all things, hopefully we learned from experience. And now I think the challenge is, it was never cannabis. Now it's, why not cannabis?
Yeah.
And one of the really important things is that, for me, is that the way we approach cannabis, as I said, needs to change from a negative to a positive. Cannabis needs to be seen as a real positive engine of change for the future, but that's based on replacing oils for plastic. Why are we still using oils and plastic? I mean, it is just crazy to me that we are still in this position. But COP26 is arriving in Scotland at the end of this year.
Yeah.
Again, these are moments of time where change is really possible. And I personally think that change is really going to be possible. The UK government is allowing access to cannabis. So to give you some kind of idea of where the current situation is, the UK is currently, and we are the biggest exporter of cannabis, or one of the biggest exporters. Strangely enough, all of the cannabis that you get prescribed if you go for a medical prescription now is imported.
Yeah, from Israel a lot of the time.
Absolutely. I mean, this is crazy stuff. Now, you don't get me wrong. You can get a prescription for anything, as long as you can convince a consultant that, and what they're looking for is, are you going to be a problem user? Are you going to abuse cannabis? Well, I don't want that. I don't think anybody wants problem users. I think that's the same in gambling, in alcohol. You don't want problem use, but it's about people's freedom of choice, and it is about people understanding. And I think part of the education process that we all need to go through, clinicians and people, about how to use cannabis to its best benefit across all of these different industries, is that we need to understand exactly what its best use is. So one of the things is it can make biofuels, but it's not very effective as a biofuel. So rather than kind of talking about biofuels, there are better plants that make better biofuels. Let's use it to replace concrete, which is one of the worst carbon producers there is. So I think we've got to look at it as a potential medicine. We have to look at it as a potential new building material, and all of the other things. It can create graphene. It is a carbon base. So graphene is a new miracle material. Cannabis has been around for years, and we're only just discovering what a miracle kind of thing it is.
Yeah, it's frustrating as well when you said that there about the problem users. That I think this is one of the things that kind of frustrates me a lot, is that they assume that by targeting, I mean, it doesn't matter if it's, like you said, alcohol, tobacco, or sugar. We're never wanting an abuse ever with anything. But the reality is, individuals who tend to abuse substances anyway. It's very personality orientated, apart from individual circumstances. Very often there could be a social circumstance, or potentially a time in somebody's life where maybe the likelihood of them abusing a substance is increased because the times are very difficult for that person. But the reality is, proportionately, it does seem to be that substance abusers tend to be substance abusers, and this is the reality. And it seems to be preventing young children from using these substances seems to be the best preventative measure, because as we've seen, very often you have THC edibles that get in the hands of children and things like that. But the reality is, that's going on now with prohibition. So inevitably it's not working. So we might as well just put in regulatory positions and barriers to prevent those most accountable, most sensitive to it in society from being harmed. I mean, one of the examples I like to use is the epilepsy. We do make films. There are people with epilepsy that respond negatively to flashing images, but we put a warning in front of that film before the people watch it. This is a liberty that's not given to cannabis, and never has been. It's almost as if it's this extra demon, when the reality is it's crucial for our dietary input for our endocannabinoid system, which causes an enormous amount of frustration for people who are aware of this, and yet they're dealing with a polarized society. Of, on one end of the spectrum, you've got an emerging industry, and on another end of the spectrum, you have people that are saying that you're engaged with a substance which causes psychosis, and etc., etc., etc. So like you said there, I mean, I do believe that education is key.
I mean, I just to come to illustrate what you were saying there about kind of abuse. I think psychosis, that is a typical one, isn't it? And it is kind of, we can't allow access to cannabis because everybody goes psychotic. I told you my brother's a professor. That's a very, so I give you, this is confirmation of bias. This is absolute confirmation of bias in the academic medical world, that here's my mom, she's got Alzheimer's. I'm looking at the potential research. Now, it's not double-blind trial research. It's not certified academically, peer-reviewed, but there's circumstantial evidence, observational trials that say, hold on, yes, this cannabis looks like it actually does benefit patients who've got dementia. So I went to my brother and I said, what do you think? Should we give it to my mom? And he said, no, it is illegal, which at the time, to get a medical cannabis, and it turns you psychotic. And I thought, yes, that's the very essence of the problem. We're talking about my mom, who's got Alzheimer's, completely off a trolley, and we're worrying that she's going to be turned psychotic by cannabis. I mean, come on, please. Yeah. So this is a kind of confirmation of bias. Mm-hmm. I've always understood cannabis to be really bad, therefore it always must be really bad, even if the evidence is showing that it's not that bad. And actually, the evidence is showing that it's really good in a great many conditions and it has real benefit.
I mean, even when you mentioned as well, Alzheimer's, I think, and other varieties of dementia, I included it in the book that cannabis comes along and it seems to disintegrate amyloid plaques, which are largely influential with Alzheimer's. And this is crucial when it comes to, to cognitive improvement.
I'll give you my personal experience of this. So I am a medical cannabis patient. Those are some of my prescriptions at the back there. And I personally, this is one of the really interesting things. Clinicians like to prescribe extracted tinctures. That is something that they're used to. They understand that it's something you put in your mouth. I personally don't like edibles. When you use cannabis in that form, it goes through your liver. Instead of being delta 9, it turns into a 11 hydroxy, etc., etc. So it's more potent and it lasts for longer. But that's my particular prescription is for back pain. And what happens is I'm still active. I might be an old geezer, but I still like to be active because I believe that's the best way of staying healthy. And so I get back pain normally at the end of the day and stuff. I kind of stand up, move around, got all kinds of things to remind me to do that. But every now and again, I get real breakout pains in the bottom of my back, and the only thing that really shifts it instantly is a vaporized cannabis. I can go with a balanced CBD THC, and I can use a medium strength THC. The higher THC strengths, they don't suit my pain. Everybody's uniquely different, and that is why this is such a personalized medicine. And I think that one of the ways forward for the future of this is that we will all kind of find out about our endocannabinoid system. And there are genetic tests that are kind of coming through. Genetic might not be the right terminology, but there are these tests that, just like you take tests to highlight any kind of allergies you've got, these tests will isolate your endocannabinoid system and say, right, this is what you're looking for and this is what you need to do. There's some really interesting tech and technology coming, and that just creates a better lifestyle for everyone. I mean, I'm a real advocate for using cannabis for stress reduction. I think that I come in with COVID. I mean, who the hell after this year? I mean, I lived when nuclear war was imminent, and the last 12 months has had nothing on that. Yeah. So it's crazy.
Yeah, I mean, just when you mentioned that time about the subjectivity of the endocannabinoid system, I think that's why many individuals coming new to this and being first informed of the endocannabinoid system, they see cannabis as a snake oil. They're like, how can it do all these things? And the reality is, and also I think some people get put off because they'll see friends or family taking CBD, they'll engage with it and it'll do nothing because the proportion that they're taking, the CBD content, the percentage, none of these things conform to what this endocannabinoid system requires. And I think other variables that are important are potentially metabolic enzymes, which play an impact onto the endogenous cannabinoids, which very often get missed because we're so focused on the receptor endocannabinoid system relationship, when the reality is it should be quite interesting in the near future to see how much of an impact we could stimulate our endocannabinoid system naturally by adjusting the metabolic enzymes which regulate the endocannabinoid systems in the first place. But again, these will all be things that will come over the years. And I think, I mean, I think it was last year, and I interviewed Professor Mike Barnes, and he said this thing, the most exciting thing he sees about cannabis is the fact that it says we'll never stop learning about it. And it does seem
Absolutely,
apparent.
absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I think that is really, really important. It's one of those things that I think is going to be really the most important development in the coming of personalized medicine, and I think that's really starting. And I think terpenes, because when we talk about, and I know that there's this kind of debate raging about medical cannabis, whether we should even use the term medical cannabis, but for me, it's regulated access. At the moment, you have to prove that you have a condition that market authorized pharmaceuticals haven't worked for.
Yeah.
But so many people.
What I was going to say, why it's good having a medical cannabis terminology is because it does that does differentiate between individuals that be using recreationally and individuals that be using for a particular ailment, symptoms or this kind of thing. So there is a differentiation. That it's good to have medical cannabis as a term, but I could see why people would be frustrated because even using recreationally, you do get medical therapeutic benefits. So there is, I understand, I do. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. It's the whole thing moving forward is based around this idea that we're in this kind of transitional period. The UK is way behind the rest of the Commonwealth. You've got Canada, Australia, and lots of the Caribbean, parts of Africa. They're moving much faster than we are. We're still very reticent. We're still kind of holding back this King Canute thing that. And I've got letters. In fact, here you go. I've got a letter. This is a letter from my MP, who happens to be Harriet Baldwin. I've written to her from 2016, virtually every year. And slowly the message she has sent back has changed. Initially, it was cannabis has absolutely no benefit whatsoever. Then it's, oh, yes, it does have a benefit. And now it's kind of, yes, but it has to be medically authorized. Well, that means it's got to be grown in an EU GMP facility somewhere across the world, shipped across here, and then processed. And you're telling me at the same time that your government is committed to reducing carbon emissions, yet you won't issue the licenses to grow cannabis in this country to create the medical cannabis. It doesn't have any logic at the moment. And I think these are some of the things that will change. But having said all that, there are now more medical cannabis patients than there's ever been. And the number is only growing. And it is, people need to be aware that there is this potential that is different from all the pharmaceutical kind of drugs that are available, different from traditional herbal remedies, something that's quite unique and something that works very effectively for a lot of people. It doesn't work for everyone, absolutely not. But nothing ever works for everyone, as we've seen with vaccines and this virus. There are different things that affect different people. But one of the things the virus has shown us is that rather, now they've taken away all our permissions, when all of this is over, they should be, the government should be much more permissive and say, right, if there isn't a reason to do this, then we're going to allow you to do it, rather than saying you have to prove to us there's a reason to give you access to this. And I think these are real changes that we need to kind of move forward on.
There does seem to be echoes in the background of a decriminalisation through the back door. There didn't seem to be that kind of thing this year. I think Sadiq Khan had mentioned that he was potentially going to decriminalise in London. I think that was in the paper recently. The only thing then is that what kind of model will they be embracing? Will it be an absolute train wreck for the next 3-4 years where people are still being imprisoned while some people are being let away with it? And that perfectly brings me to what you'd included in your PCC proposal about cannabis clubs and cafes. And just how an acceptance of cannabis cafes which were licensed, regulated, as well as produced because they produce tax income, is preferable in today's society, with it being preferably obviously bottom-up approach. So is this something do you think as achievable by interacting with PCCs? Do you think that they will take this as legitimate, or will it be dismissed? I know you said obviously the flavour of cannabis seems to be getting stronger with people who aren't engaged with it, but there is still a lot of dead dogma when it comes to how people perceive cannabis. And even in the cannabis community, some people don't favour cannabis clubs. They see them as just not favourable when what they're trying to achieve with cannabis, you know, whereas others see them as an extremely community orchestrated. It strengthens the community role in cannabis. It removes the basis of corporate influence because, again, medicine is being produced locally, and nobody's going to allow their local cannabis club to produce something substandard. So there is this self-sustainability that's maintained in amongst the group. So do you think that by engaging with the PCCs, this will be something that they'll take on board?
Well, funny you should mention the PCCs. That's what I've been doing all morning. We've Access Kaneh is very much about the social justice. So we've got a page on the website about social justice. We're emailing every candidate to ask them what their position is on medical cannabis. So far, most of the responses have been, it is a national government matter. PCCs do not set this. But having said all of that, the reason that I have taken a real interest in the cannabis clubs is when I was working for Namaste, I had the pleasure of going to Spain and utilizing some of the cannabis clubs in Spain and seeing what they did and the really good work they did. And I also used to work for The Extract, and we did a tour of all the cannabis clubs or a selection of cannabis clubs in the UK. And that's where I came across Gary Yowd's and the Chilling Room is in Liverpool. And what a great venue that was. I mean, Matt, we did some initial work with Gary about how to get it to an operational model that would fit within the legislation. Now, obviously, there is a growing number of medical cannabis patients. If everybody is going to take access to medical cannabis, then one of the ways you can create people social environment is to create a social club where members of the medical cannabis community could go and interact with each other and experience the whole process of a social venue where you can consume cannabis because you are, in the government's eyes, a legal medical cannabis user. So that is perfectly possible to create in this environment. Now, the problem becomes once you kind of say, okay, that's fine, but then we can't all afford the £200-300 a month that is going to be required to fund the prescriptions. So can we develop a community-based approach? I absolutely believe that that should be an option, and it should be something that the local authorities, with police and crime commissioners and the community, and with committed medical cannabis users, look at and work together. There are precedents for this, toleration zones, whereby everybody agrees this is a good thing, and we apply the policy of Hadoken, which the Dutch use, which is we turn a blind eye and we do not kind of prosecute. And you can see this. The principle of Hadoken is used every day in pubs. You should never be drunk. Yet the pub's purpose is to be happy and merry. Let's put it like that. So you can be in a pub, you can be happy and merry, possibly breaking a law, maybe not. But we don't prosecute people in that environment.
Many people will be critical, saying that the medicine that we produce locally wouldn't be as of same standard as that we'd be able to get through pharmaceutical grade and that kind of thing. And one of the things I always think that would immediately be able to resolve that issue is third-party lab testing. You can easily get away situations where you can even send off food or liquids or any samples you wish, really, to get third-party lab testing at a relatively reasonable price. So it seems like this is something that's purposefully ignored when that critical analysis is ventured upon, you know.
Absolutely. I think one of the really important bits moving forward is that there is now portable testing equipment. It doesn't need to be the massive machines that are used on purpose. Israel is one of the most advanced countries in terms of technology, and they have several testing devices. There's several testing devices that are from the USA, because obviously they've got a big industry moving forward there. And when cannabis becomes federally legal in the USA, that's when the real gates of change will open. Hopefully, moving forward, the Biden administration will reduce the kind of hindrance they put in there. The reason nobody can get bank accounts if you're in the cannabis industry, and trust me, it is really difficult, is because it is federally illegal in the USA. When that changes, then the industry can really start to accelerate and create the jobs and opportunity that it should do. I mean, it's funny. I was talking to one of my Canadian counterparts who I've known for years, who's fighting a battle in Manitoba, Jesse Lavoie. He's fighting a battle in Manitoba. Manitoba is the only province in Canada that does not allow for consumers to grow their own cannabis. So in Canada, when it was medical, you could convert your medical prescription into a grow your own prescription. You could convert the number of plants, you could grow the number of plants that you wanted. And part of growing is a therapeutic process as well. The tendering of plants, there's a whole kind of process that goes on here. And I mean, just as making this fight in Canada, it's the last province, whereas here, we're fighting for the right to be able to grow. So cannabis community clubs are that kind of intermediary stepping stone, because people can group together, they can buy the testing equipment, or they can use third-party testing. And standards are really important to me, really important. I might say that EU GMP, which is a pharmaceutical standard, is not where you should be saying medical cannabis should be. A different set of standards, more suited to what cannabis is a much better option. But you do need standards. As we've talked about, the remediation properties of cannabis means that it absorbs everything from the soil. So you don't want heavy metal toxins. You don't want those kind of things in cannabis. You need to make sure it's not got mold. You need to make sure that the terpene profile, the cannabinoid profile are what your expectation is. One of the things about medical cannabis is that it is grown in such conditions that it has reproducibility in the majority of times. So the plant that you grow today will marginally be different from the plant you grow tomorrow, but not significantly. When you grow it yourself, as I'm sure many of the viewers are aware, changes in the environment, all kinds of things affect the whole output of what you're doing. So this is why, in my opinion, medical cannabis, and my experience is that I use less medical cannabis than I did illicit cannabis when I was using that.
Yeah. Is that, when you say you use less, do you still feel an absence of, I'm assuming obviously you're cultivating, but do you still feel an absence of the relationship with the plant? Because it does seem to be that, I have a friend who uses medical cannabis for MS, and he claims that it gives an equal therapeutic influence to his condition, tendering the plants, as he does actually consuming the plant.
So he should be able to convert his prescription, and which we haven't spoken about the NHS, but the NHS are starting to look at cannabis in new ways. The real impediment, the real kind of block on this is NICE. Once NICE guidelines change, but if you look at their pain guidelines, they're saying now, right, we're not going to prescribe opioids, we're not going to prescribe all of these painkillers, naproxen, cocodamol, all of these things. What we're going to do is we're going to tell you to go out and get exercise, we're going to tell you to go out and get antidepressants, and we're going to talk about natural therapies. Well, hold on, isn't that cannabis?
Yeah.
It's an antidepressant. It makes you, in my particular case, especially with the right strain, makes me energized, makes me want to go and do things. I think there's real opportunities. And NICE, again, comes back to this confirmation of bias. I've always believed it's bad, therefore it is bad. Therefore, you need to prove above and beyond any other kind of drug there is that it has benefit. And I think that's the stage we're at now. But that proof is being generated.
Yeah, things like Project 21 are hugely complementary to creating a large body of qualitative data, because I think this is what comes hand in hand with cannabis. The absence of legitimate empirical data we do have, and I think it might be different now, but I remember at this point last year, NICE had that cannabis was not applicable for chronic pain, which is absolutely ridiculous because it's so applicable for chronic pain because it's non-localized issues, receptors all across the body. It's perfect for it. And it just shows the detachment from the NICE, the individuals in NICE that are actually implementing these regulations, that they have no knowledge. It's almost as if they're going along aged rhetoric, you know, and that's no longer applicable now. And one interesting thing there, Tim, was when I was picturing when you said, yeah, I like to have an energy. It's the same thing. I prefer sativa during the day. It likes energy. It keeps you boasted. And I was wondering that it's like, I have an image in my head of like 10 years time where people have like, instead of going to like, you know, Nescafe or Carte d'Or, you know, you've got like Jack Herer or you've got Blue Dream, you know.
Well, then this is exactly well, you've got to look at the kind of future is being written in legalized states where there's real access and economies are starting to grow. Going back to Jesse, the guy who is in Manitoba kind of fighting for his right to grow, he works for a large cannabis company. It has 40. These are the scale of jobs that cannabis is producing. Now that company exports all across the world. It is adding to the value of Canada's economy. And because Canada is ahead of the game in so many areas, but I have to say being caught up by Israel, by Australia, by other areas that are opening up, then these companies are going to have a competitive advantage. And that is something that the UK really needs to look at. Anybody who makes an assessment of the cannabis industry in the future looks to the horizon and says, where's it going to be? Regulation notwithstanding, so we need regulators to understand more and to kind of allow more access on the basis of it is not a harmful drug. One of the advantages of the cannabis economy is it generates income streams. So if you look at Colorado, you look at any of the states where it's been implemented. My personal favorite's Oklahoma, because they made the cost of Oklahoma, one of the most conservative states in the USA, they made the cost of entry into the cannabis industry very low, and they moved it forward. So, and they moved it forward by making licensing easy access. And they've got one of the highest take-ups of cannabis in the USA, and they're generating lots of tax dollars. But what they're also doing is investing in programs about education. One of the things is, as we were talking about before, underage use. Well, that's diminishing. In most of the legal states, that's diminished. And you find that access to, I've frozen.
Yeah.
I don't know why.
I was waiting for it to just fix itself.
Yeah, so was I. I don't know what's going on there.
It's funny, Tom. It's like, I've frozen.
That's it. Cut off. The government's cut us off, mate. They said, bugger.
They're on to us. They've tapped the wire, Tim.
Yeah. I am just frozen. Oh, there we go. There we go. We're back. We're back.
Good man. So, yeah.
So where was I? So, I mean, the potential is that we create tax revenue in investing in education programs and investing in, and no matter what you do, anything you change, any regulation. I'm old enough to remember when pubs closed. They opened at 10 o'clock in the morning. They closed at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. They opened at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and they closed at 10:30. That was how you consumed alcohol back in that day. It was very restrictive, and you had people really piling down the pints come 10 o'clock, ready for 10:30, and you had this thing. Now, it didn't work. That was prohibition on a small scale here, and I think that, but there will always be problem drinkers. The alcohol industry contributes to programs that help problem drinkers. Just like with cannabis, there will be problem users. We have to face that. There will be, but we have to enable those. At the moment, those problem users, they go unnoticed until it's way too late, and they've gone down a road that has been very detrimental to their lives. And I don't want to see that. I don't want to see anybody going down that road. But prohibition's not the answer to that. And anybody who argues it isn't looking at the evidence at all.
Even when you say that, the prohibition actually exacerbates that, because one of the things that a friend said to me before in the past was that he says, and because I was complaining actually years ago, and I was like, oh, about just the negative side effects that many people experience with cannabis that I'd never experienced. And he went, the issue that why some people seem to have negative connections to it is that we don't have a unit measurement. We have an alcohol situation where you have, this is the amount that's safe and this is the amount that's not. The difficulty that's then presented with cannabis is that how on earth are you supposed to provide a unit measurement which is relatively generic, widely applicable, and yet taps into the individual basis of the subjective endocannabinoid system? That is an almost near impossible task. And yet, in order to actually achieve that, we really do need to accelerate research, accelerate the basis of cannabinoid interaction with terpenes and flavonoids and other relevant fatty acids, in order to really fine tune so we can prevent people abusing cannabis. Because even people that use cannabis recreationally, they use it frequently and they would have nothing bad to say about it, they're still able to abuse it over the course of the week, over the course of the day. That still happens because there isn't a measurement. There's essentially a subjective analysis of how does this feel for me? And then you then compare that in proportion to how you function throughout the day, and you kind of come up with a rough estimate of what's acceptable to take during the day and what's not. But again, that is so far beyond anybody. If somebody was coming new to cannabis, they would never be able to achieve that level of understanding about the relationship with herself and the plant, which requires, again, like we've mentioned, education, further research, and safeguards in a accessible society which still allows a prevention from people abusing it.
I agree. Cannabis doesn't work in the same way as alcohol, so it's quite difficult to make units of measure.
Yeah.
But so taking that point and just looking at the legislation, which is relevant to CBD, which, remember, is a cannabinoid. And there are so many possibilities with cannabinoids and what they can do and how they can replace things. But that unit of measure is an interesting idea. So currently, the UK government says, right, okay, we will set a unit of measure of 1 milligram. So 1 milligram of any controlled substance in any container makes it illegal. Okay, fine, fair enough. So 1 milligram in a 10 milliliter bottle of CBD, so 1 milligram of THC makes it illegal if it's above 1 milligram. But that also applies if it's a tanker size. So it's still 1 milligram. It's a container. The legislation is completely impossible to understand, and the way it's imposed makes it very difficult. So the obvious solution is parts per million. How many parts per million of the THC molecule do you allow, and you say that is an acceptable level? That's what everybody else in the world is moving to. One of the interesting things is that the Canadians are working on setting up an ISO standard. Excuse me. They're going to set up an ISO standard for thanks. They're going to set up an ISO standard for cannabis. So international standards are going to be made for cannabis. One of the things there is that once we get to that level, guess who's going to put in the big evidence pile about how to make cannabis work properly? It's going to be the Canadians. Who's got the biggest industry? So it comes down to, we all need to get around the table and do this for the benefit. One of the companies I work with, Halo Collective, they're growing cannabis in Lesotho, which is a country in South Africa, or a province in South Africa. And they are very much about social justice. And many of the companies that are working in South America, again, focused on social justice. This is a cash crop that can really deliver change to some of the poorest people in the world, because it actually grows best in their environments. And so we need to look at this and say, this is a change that we need to make across the world for so many different reasons. And I think that if we can make that change happen within the next 5 years, the next election is in 5 years' time. I hope that cannabis, just like it was in the Canadian election of change, we can make that happen here.
Yeah, I sincerely hope, Tim, by the end of this year, it's looking like a different landscape than it was last time, because it really is. There's everybody I speak to, and even people that aren't really familiar with cannabis, to the same economic benefit. and what the potential cannabis has, they can see that this fits the void for so many different factors. The social and mental health. I mean, you included it obviously in your report thing here that it's like this: the social and mental impact COVID has had on the general public has been astronomical, to say the least. And the inevitable, what inevitably can fill that is cannabis. That's what essentially what we're dealing with. It's a negative situation that can only be resolved by something that's holistic, that's beneficial, and it causes homeostasis. And I think almost on a social element, it sounds very figurative, but it's the reality that cannabis causes physiological homeostasis. It also causes psychological homeostasis. You know, it really gives balancing and thought. And then collectively, when you're in a group of people, as an individual, if your thoughts are balanced and then you engage with a group of people who are also in a similar circumstance, you're creating with a social, psychological balance and amongst the group just by the base of this recreational substance. You then exchange that for alcohol. I'm by no means criticizing alcohol, but the basis of how alcohol interacts neurologically is it stimulates the primal elements of the brain. This is fact, and it's not an accident then that you then get consequential with its abuse, poor behaviour and antisocial behaviour and stuff like this. So I mean, so the police crime commissioner report campaign thing here, what is it you're actually attempting to achieve with this?
Well, what we're looking at is the change that happened in North America, Canada, and many of the states in the USA. They achieved change by people voting for change. The only opportunity the UK really has to express its opinion about cannabis in any meaningful way, it'll never be a topic that changes general elections. The police and crime commissioner elections is something where turnout is really low. Historically, and this year it'll probably be even lower, obviously because of COVID and people won't bother. So there is a real chance. Now, what we're doing is we are emailing every candidate with their response to a list of 10 questions. We will publish those on the website. It is up to every individual to make their own decision. Personally, I'm going to vote for the candidate that has the most pro-cannabis, least enforcement orientated policy, and hopefully somebody actually buys into the whole process of a token and looks at the Dutch model and says, right, well, we've got laws, but we don't really need to enforce them. We can turn a blind eye here while the main politicians in Parliament change the real legislation. So the Misuse of Drugs Act is, I think everybody is now agreeing, it is not fit for purpose.
Yeah.
It needs rewriting, and it needs to be based on foundational, factual evidence. And we need to get that sorted. We need to send a signal, and that signal is by votes. I still believe in democracy, and I believe that votes matter. So we're going to publish a list of all the responses we get. There are Green Party candidates who are they have a policy on cannabis. So do the Liberal Democrats. So do Plaid Cymru. Labour Party just seem to be pointed both ways at the same time and aren't really moving forward. The Conservatives, surprisingly, some of them are pro, some of them are not. It is based around what you think is the best use of your vote. But in my particular opinion, police and crime commissioners is a really good way of changing the way that people look at cannabis and drugs policy in general, to be honest. Yeah. And if we can vote for pro-change candidates and vote cannabis, I think there's real opportunity to send a signal to the major political parties that we all want change.
Yeah. So for all the viewers and subscribers out there, it's like essentially I put all the links in the description box below, but you'd recommend just become active, Tim, just push through this because this
absolutely. We put all the information available. Email your candidate, find out, engage with them, but most importantly, go and vote. Mm-hmm. To be honest, the number of votes, if we could get a Green Party candidate into a location based upon their cannabis policy, remembering again, turnout is so low. So when everybody goes, oh, the Greens will never get in, this is a very different election. Yeah. Turnout is traditionally low, and all it takes is for a group of committed activists to really change this. And the cannabis community is one of those communities that has the power to do that. If rather than all bickering, as we all know we all do, we actually do something, that is cohesive, and we work together and cooperational.
Thanks to Tim for giving me his time, and thanks to you for sticking around until the end of the video. I sincerely hope you enjoyed the content. I'll see you next time.